I never saw it coming. That's the thing that eats at me now, looking back. How blind I was. I thought I had a good life. I thought Lily and I were solid. We weren't perfect, but who is? I worked hard, she took care of things at home. The kind of routine you get comfortable in. Safe. Stable. And then one day, out of nowhere, everything I thought I knew about us gets turned upside down. It all started with the rent. We were behind. Again. We'd been struggling a bit lately, trying to juggle bills and making sure we had enough for everything. But this month, we were in real trouble. I'd been late before, but it was always because of some emergency. Car repairs, an unexpected doctor's visit, something. Lily hated it, but she never gave me that look. You know, the one that says, "You're failing me." But this time, she was more anxious. She told me she'd handle it, that she'd figure something out. She always had some plan up her sleeve when things got tight. But that evening, she came home a little earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen, grabbing a beer, trying to shake off the workday. When I heard the door, I turned around, expecting a tired smile and the usual, "Hey, honey, how was your day?" But instead, she stood there, arms crossed, looking like she'd just made some big decision. "You're not gonna like this," she said, her voice cold. She never talked like that. I put the beer down. "What's going on?" I didn't like the way she was looking at me. She sighed, like she was trying to make herself comfortable with the words before she let them slip out. I talked to Carl. He said he'd let us off the hook for the rent, but we have to make it up to him. You know, somehow. Carl Matthews, our landlord, had always been a bit of a hard-ass, but he wasn't evil. Or at least, I didn't think he was. He wasn't the kind of guy you expected to throw people under the bus. I looked at her, waiting for her to explain further, but all I got was that damn look on her face. Like she was bracing for an explosion she knew was coming. I must have stared at her too long because she quickly added, "It's not what you think, Ethan." But I did think. I thought she was doing something stupid, something desperate. "What does he want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shifted uncomfortably. He said he'd let it slide if I did something for him. Something personal. I blinked. Personal? Like what? Lily's face turned pale. I could see the guilt washing over her, but there was also something else, something in her eyes I didn't recognize. It was like she wasn't even looking at me anymore. "He wants me to sleep with him, Ethan," she said, barely above a whisper. Her voice was flat, like she was talking about a grocery list. My heart stopped. Everything went cold. The room felt like it was closing in on me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to shout, to scream, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just stood there, staring at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. I didn't know how to react. Should I be angry? Hurt? Should I throw something? I mean, how do you even respond to something like that? But she didn't give me time to think. "Please don't freak out," she begged, stepping toward me. Her eyes were wide, like she was looking for some kind of reassurance that wasn't coming. "Ethan, I didn't want to do it. He said he'd help us." I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to do anything. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't come to me first, why she hadn't trusted me enough to figure it out together. But instead, I stood there in shock, hearing her try to explain something that didn't make any sense. "Lily," I started, my voice shaking. "Are you seriously telling me that you're gonna sleep with this guy just to cover our rent?" She winced like I slapped her. "It's not like that, okay? It's not some affair, it's just one thing. Just to get us out of this mess." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't just the fact that she was willing to go through with it. It was the way she was saying it, like it wasn't even a big deal. Like it was just a small price to pay to keep our lives from falling apart. "I don't know what to say to you right now, Lily," I muttered, feeling the anger and humiliation creep in like a slow burn. I don't even recognize you anymore." She flinched again, her eyes filling with tears. But it wasn't guilt I saw. It was fear. Fear of me, fear of what I might do, maybe even fear of what she'd already done. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about the rent. This wasn't about some temporary fix. Something had changed between us. Something that could never be undone. She took a step back, as if trying to put distance between us. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't know what else to do. And that's when I knew. I knew this wasn't just about covering a missed payment. There was something darker going on. Something that made me feel like I didn't even know the woman I'd spent the last 10 years with. But I wasn't ready to face that yet. Not in the moment. I needed time to process it. I needed time to decide how I was going to handle this betrayal. I forced myself to nod, even though everything inside me was screaming to do something, anything, to get out of there. But I didn't. Instead, I turned away, grabbed my jacket, and walked out the door. I couldn't even look at her. I spent the next few days in a haze. Everything around me felt like I was watching it through thick glass, distant and muffled. The sounds, the sights, even the way I moved, they all felt foreign, like I wasn't even in my own body. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't make sense of any of it. My mind was tangled up in a million questions, but they all kept circling around the same one. How could she do this to me? Lily barely spoke to me after that night. It was like we were strangers in the same house. I could feel the tension between us, thick in the air, suffocating. She would go about her day, cooking, cleaning, but there was a coldness in her eyes, something that didn't belong. It was like I wasn't even her husband anymore, just someone she was avoiding. The nights were the worst. We would go to bed, side by side, but it felt like there was an ocean between us. No touch, no words, no warmth. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the thought of her with Carl kept hitting me, over and over, until I couldn't breathe. I could imagine it all so vividly, her lying there with him, doing whatever he wanted, while I was left in the dark, helpless and betrayed. And then there was Carl. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I had seen him around a few times, the kind of guy you wouldn't think much about unless you had to. He was friendly enough, but you could tell he was the kind of person who had his own agenda, always looking for an angle. But I never thought he'd go this far, using his position to manipulate my wife. I hated him. Not just for what he had done to Lily, but for what he was doing to me. He knew everything. He knew our situation, our struggles. He knew Lily was vulnerable, and he took advantage of it. But I also knew this wasn't just about Carl. It was about Lily, too. The fact that she had agreed to it without hesitation, without even asking me, made something inside me snap. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was numb, maybe. But there was a cold fury simmering beneath the surface, one that I wasn't ready to unleash just yet. I had to figure out what to do. I wasn't the type to lash out on impulse. I'd seen too many people do that, and it always ended in regret. I needed to be smart. I needed to get control of the situation. If Lily was going to play her part in this twisted little arrangement, I would have to play mine. But I wouldn't just let it slide. I spent the next few days watching, waiting. I kept my distance, observing her, trying to figure out how far she had really gone. It was hard to tell at first. Lily was good at pretending everything was fine. She'd try to act normal, as if nothing had changed. But I could see through it. Her attempts at being casual were transparent, and every time she looked at me, there was something in her eyes that screamed guilt. I didn't confront her again. Not right away. I knew that if I did, she'd lie. She'd twist things, make it sound like it was all just some little misunderstanding, a bad decision that didn't mean anything. I could already hear her excuses in my head. She'd say it wasn't like I thought. She'd tell me that it wasn't an affair, just a one-time thing. But I knew better. This wasn't just about covering rent anymore. It was about something deeper, something darker that neither of us wanted to face. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. Lily had crossed a line. Carl wasn't the only one at fault. She had betrayed me, too. That thought stung, a bitter truth I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. But it was the reality I had to live with now. And as much as it hurt to acknowledge it, I knew I wasn't just going to let her walk away from this. No, this wasn't going to end quietly. There was no way I could let it go, not after what had happened. But I wasn't going to confront her directly, not yet. I needed time to figure out how to make this work for me. I needed a plan. I had already started to think about Carl, about what I could do to expose him, to make him feel the consequences of his actions. There was something about him that felt like he had a lot to hide, and I had a way of getting people to talk when I needed them to. Lily might have thought she could just go along with this and make everything go back to normal. But I knew better. The truth had a way of coming out, and when it did, there would be no going back. The question wasn't whether I would take revenge, it was how. And the answer was clear. It would be cold, it would be calculated, and it would leave both of them broken. That much I was sure of. It's funny how the world keeps spinning, even when your life feels like it's been ripped apart. I still had to go to work, pay the bills, do all the things people do when they're pretending to be fine. But inside, I was unraveling. Every moment I spent with Lily felt like I was suffocating, drowning in the weight of her betrayal. And every time I had to look Carl in the eye, I felt my stomach churn with disgust. I knew I couldn't just sit there and let things play out. If I did, I'd lose everything, including my own sense of control. Lily thought I was passive, that I'd just go along with whatever she wanted. I had always been the laid-back type, the don't-rock-the-boat guy. But deep down, I wasn't that person. Not anymore. I knew the first thing I had to do was get a handle on what Carl was up to. If I could find a way to make him pay, to expose him for who he really was, then maybe Lily would understand the kind of mess she had gotten herself into. She thought she was just doing something to get us out of a tight spot, but she was wrong. She'd opened the door to something much bigger, and I wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. I started by looking into Carl's business dealings. He wasn't just a landlord, he had other investments, some shady ones, too. I'd heard rumors over the years. Little whispers from tenants who'd had problems with him, but nothing concrete. Just enough to make you think there was more to the guy than his polished exterior. I needed something, anything, to hold over his head. I'd always been good at keeping my ears open. People talk when you know how to ask the right questions, how to make them feel comfortable. So I started poking around, asking people I knew who might have crossed paths with Carl. A few calls, a couple of casual conversations at the local bar, and I started to hear things. There were whispers about a few properties he owned that were being rented out under questionable circumstances. Tax evasion. Bribes. Nothing that would land him in prison, but enough to make things uncomfortable if someone pushed hard enough. That's when I decided to reach out to an old contact I had, someone who worked in real estate law. We'd done a few small deals together in the past, but I hadn't spoken to him in a while. I made the call, kept it short and professional, told him I was looking into Carl Matthews. His response was quick, almost too quick. "I can get you what you need," he said. A few days later, I had a pile of documents that made my skin crawl. Carl's properties weren't just a little shady. They were a mess. Code violations, unreported tenants, even some evidence of bribing local inspectors. There were enough red flags to make anyone with half a brain realize that Carl wasn't the upstanding businessman he liked to pretend to be. I sat on the information for a day, turning it over in my mind. The plan was starting to form, but it had to be precise. I couldn't go at him recklessly. If I made the wrong move, he could turn the tables on me, accuse me of something I didn't do. I needed leverage. And I needed Lily to understand that what she had done wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a much larger game, one that she hadn't even realized she was playing. But what about her? What about Lily? I hadn't forgotten about her. If anything, her place in all of this was more complicated than I had originally thought. She wasn't innocent, but I could tell she was starting to unravel too. I saw it in her eyes when she looked at me. She wasn't just scared of Carl anymore. She was scared of me. Scared of what I might do with the information I had. And that gave me a small sense of power. It was a twisted satisfaction to know she was starting to feel the weight of her choices. I didn't confront her directly. Not yet. I needed her to sweat, to feel the pressure of the situation, to realize that she had messed with the wrong person. And when she did, when she was desperate enough, that's when I'd strike. I started planting little seeds, letting her think I was getting closer to the truth. I'd drop small hints, things I'd learned about Carl, about his shady dealings, things that made it clear I wasn't as clueless as she thought. It wasn't enough to make her crack, but it was enough to keep her on edge. I watched her closely, noticed the way she'd glance at me when I mentioned Carl's name, how her face would twitch when I spoke about his business practices. She knew. She knew what was coming. But that was just the beginning. The real move, the one that would truly set everything in motion, was coming. I wasn't going to just destroy Carl and leave it at that. No, I wanted Lily to feel the full weight of what she had done. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't just about a bad choice. It was about trust, about loyalty, about everything she had thrown away. The longer I waited, the colder I got. The plan was taking shape in my mind, piece by piece. But it wasn't until I saw Carl one last time that I truly knew how far I was willing to go. And I was ready. Ready for the final act. The night I saw Carl again, everything changed. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. It was late, dark outside, the streets nearly empty except for the occasional car passing by. I had been stewing for days, waiting for the right moment, looking for my opening. And when I saw him pulling up to the building, talking on his phone like he always did, something inside me snapped. I didn't plan on confronting him that night. Not yet, not in person. But as I watched him walk toward the door, all that restraint, all that control I'd been holding onto, started to slip away. It was like I couldn't breathe until I said what I needed to say. The rage had been building for weeks, fed by the lies, the betrayal, the feeling of being so utterly powerless. I walked up behind him, close enough that he wouldn't notice until it was too late. I could see him smirk as he hung up, that cocky look of someone who thought they had all the power. But when he turned around and saw me standing there, it was like he'd seen a ghost. His face went pale, but he tried to cover it up. He wasn't good at hiding his panic, not when it came to me. I had watched him enough, followed his moves, learned the little things that told me when someone was bluffing or nervous. He stammered, asked if everything was okay, but his eyes said something else. He was scared. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch, letting him sweat under the weight of it. Carl Matthews, the man who thought he could use my wife to get what he wanted, had no idea what was coming. I didn't need to make a scene. That was the beauty of it. I had everything I needed already, everything to bring him down. I wasn't just going to ruin his reputation. I was going to make sure he lost everything. His business, his precious image, the trust he'd built up with everyone around him. I was going to expose him for what he really was, a fraud. And he knew I had the power to do it. Carl tried to play it off, but I could see the cracks starting to show. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, but now he was staring at the one thing he couldn't control, me. I wasn't the guy who let things slide anymore. It wasn't until I leaned in, just a little closer, that I saw his composure truly break. I spoke low but firm. You've made a mistake, Carl. A big one. And I'm going to make sure you pay for it. Every damn thing you've done will come out. I have everything I need. He didn't speak at first. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out if I was bluffing, if he could talk his way out of it. But I wasn't giving him the option. I wasn't playing by his rules anymore. The game had shifted, and he was about to lose. Carl started to bluster, trying to regain his control. He threatened me, tried to intimidate me with his usual tactics, but I wasn't scared anymore. The truth was a weapon, and I was holding it. I had everything ready to tear down his life, and there was no stopping me now. But I didn't get angry. I didn't shout. I just stood there, letting him squirm, enjoying the fear creeping into his eyes. He was trying to control the situation, but it was already slipping from his grasp. I could see the panic in his movements, how his hands fumbled for his phone like he was about to make some call, like there was someone who could bail him out of this. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low. You think I'm just going to walk away from this? No. You're going to face the consequences. I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are. That's when I saw it. His mask cracked for just a second. His eyes widened, then quickly narrowed, like he realized I wasn't the Ethan he could walk all over anymore. I had turned the tables, and I wasn't letting him backpedal. He could tell I wasn't bluffing. It was all on the table now. I turned and walked away before he could get another word in, not bothering to look back. But I knew that moment would stick with him, that sense of helplessness that would follow him around from now on. I had made my move, and Carl knew I wasn't someone he could push around anymore. But as I walked away, something else settled in the pit of my stomach. The anger, the need for revenge, had been so strong, so consuming. But now, in the silence of the night, it didn't feel like victory. It felt hollow. I had gone after Carl. I had the power, the leverage to destroy him. But in that moment, I realized that even if I brought him down, it wouldn't fix what was broken. It wouldn't erase the betrayal, the pain that Lily had caused. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The betrayal wasn't just Carl's fault. It wasn't just about some rent payment. It was about everything Lily had thrown away, the trust she had crushed, the life we had built that she so casually destroyed. And no matter how far I went with my revenge on Carl, it wouldn't change that. But I wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. There was one more thing I had to do. One final piece to this puzzle that I had been building for weeks. And when I was done, when everything came to light, I would make sure Lily understood exactly what she had lost. After that night with Carl, I felt like I was on the edge of something. The weight of it all hadn't quite hit me yet, but I knew it was coming. I had been building this plan for weeks, piece by piece, like a slow-moving storm. But as the days passed, I started to realize that my revenge wasn't going to be as satisfying as I'd hoped. Lily kept her distance, but there was something different now. She wasn't just avoiding me out of guilt. There was fear in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. She knew the truth was coming out, and she could feel the tension rising. But she still didn't know the half of it. I watched her closely. Her attempts to pretend everything was fine, to go about her day like nothing had happened, felt almost pathetic now. Every time I looked at her, I saw the cracks in the facade. I knew she was trying to justify what she had done, but it didn't matter anymore. She'd already crossed the line, and nothing she said or did could fix it. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront her directly. Not yet. I was too focused on the bigger picture. Carl, his dirty little secrets, the way his world was about to come crashing down. I had enough to ruin him, to make sure he never used anyone else the way he'd used Lily. But there was one more thing I needed. Proof. Something that would tie Carl's shady dealings directly to Lily. I wasn't going to let her off easy. Not after what she'd done. I spent the next few days getting everything I could on Carl. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about showing Lily the man she had sold herself to, the man who had used her to cover his own tracks. I dug through records, made calls, pieced together evidence of his lies and corruption. The deeper I went, the more I realized just how far Carl had gone. He had his fingers in all sorts of dirty dealings, bribes, code violations, under-the-table deals with shady contractors. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the bile rise in my throat. But I wasn't just doing this to bring Carl down. I was doing this to make Lily see the full extent of what she had done. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had handed herself over to someone who had no respect for her, who would have tossed her aside the moment she wasn't useful anymore. I didn't have all the answers yet. There were still pieces I needed to put together, but I could feel the endgame getting closer. And when it came, when I revealed everything, there would be no going back. It wasn't until a week later that Lily finally broke. I didn't plan it, didn't expect it. But one evening, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, she just looked at me differently. She was trying to hide it, but I could see the cracks. She was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she fiddled with her coffee cup. The guilt was written all over her face. I wasn't in a hurry to confront her. I wanted her to crack on her own. But I couldn't ignore the fact that she was trying to keep up the act, pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "I know you're angry," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "I never meant for it to get this far." I didn't say anything at first. I let her stew in her words, watching her face flush with embarrassment. It wasn't about her apologizing, though. It was about me giving her the space to finally understand the full scope of what she'd done. She wasn't just apologizing for sleeping with Carl. She was apologizing for betraying me, for not trusting me, for giving away everything we had built for a handful of promises that meant nothing. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered, as if that could somehow justify it. But there was no justification left. "You didn't have to do anything," I replied, finally speaking. "You could have come to me. We could have figured it out together." The silence between us grew thick. She didn't know what to say next. And I could see the moment she realized, this wasn't just about the rent anymore. It was about everything. The trust we'd lost, the life we had shared, the future she had just thrown away. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that was almost like regret. Everything I'd been working toward, everything I'd been setting up, finally came to a head. Carl's dirty laundry was out in the open, and I had all the proof I needed. It was time to pull the trigger. I met with my contact in real estate law again, handed over everything I had gathered on Carl. He was eager to help, and we made plans to go public with the information. I knew Carl would fight back. He wasn't the type to go down without a fight, but the evidence I had would be enough to bring him to his knees. I still hadn't fully confronted Lily about what she'd done. She wasn't ready to hear it. But I knew she could feel the walls closing in. She could sense it, the moment everything she had done would be exposed for what it was. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed, but I wasn't about to make it easy on her, either. I gave Carl one last chance to come clean, to face the consequences on his own terms. But I knew, deep down, he wouldn't. It was time to destroy everything. The storm hit all at once. The news hit Carl's business like a bombshell, and his world fell apart faster than I could have imagined. The media caught on quickly. The rumors about bribery and illegal deals spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the authorities to get involved. His business crumbled under the weight of it all, and soon enough, his tenants started to speak out about the shady practices. I had been right to wait. I had made sure that when Carl's secrets came to light, there would be no escape. As for Lily, when everything started to unfold, she finally understood the full impact of her actions. I didn't rub it in her face, but it didn't take long for her to realize that everything she had tried to protect, the life we had, the future she had imagined, was gone. Carl wasn't coming to save her. He wasn't the knight in shining armor she had convinced herself he was. He was just as corrupt as I'd always suspected, and now she was left with nothing. It was hard to feel satisfaction in the aftermath. Watching Carl lose everything wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. Seeing Lily's face as she realized what she had done, it didn't feel like victory. It just felt final. I had done what I set out to do. But in the end, it wasn't Carl who lost everything. It was her. And I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that in trying to get revenge, I had lost the only thing that ever really mattered. It was over, but it didn't feel like it. After everything came crashing down, Carl losing his business, the public humiliation, the legal mess that followed, it all felt empty. Like I had been so focused on taking him down, on exposing everything, that I had forgotten what the real cost was. Watching Lily watch him lose everything, I saw something in her that I hadn't expected: regret. Not just the I'm sorry kind, but real, deep regret. Like she realized the weight of her choices. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with that. I'd spent so long planning my revenge that I hadn't thought about what would happen after. Carl was finished. His reputation was in tatters, and there was no coming back from it. But Lily, she was still here. Still in my life. Still someone I had to look at every day. The house felt quieter now. The tension between us had shifted. It wasn't anger anymore, at least not the kind that had been there when I first found out. It was more like resignation. Like we were both waiting for the other to make the next move. Lily tried to talk to me, tried to apologize again. She'd say things like, "I never meant for it to go this far," or "I didn't know what I was doing," the same things she'd said before. But it didn't matter anymore. The words were just that, words. I had heard them too many times to believe them now. I knew she was sorry, but it didn't fix what had been broken. She asked me if we could start over, if we could rebuild. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to rebuild with her. Part of me still loved her, still remembered the woman I had married, the woman who had been my partner for so long. But the other part of me couldn't forget the betrayal, the way she had handed herself over to Carl like it meant nothing. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. But I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep living in a house full of broken promises. It wasn't just about what she had done, it was about who we had become. We weren't the same people we were before all of this. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I could trust her again. I packed my things that night. It wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no throwing things around. Just quiet. I left her a note, just a few words. "I can't do this anymore." I don't know what I expected her to do. Part of me wanted her to fight for us, to say something that would make me change my mind. But she didn't. She cried, I think, but she didn't try to stop me. As I walked out the door, I didn't feel relief. I felt a heavy kind of sadness, the kind that comes when you realize you've lost something irreplaceable. I had taken my revenge on Carl, but in the end, I wasn't sure who had won. There was no victory in this. Just two people, standing on opposite sides of the wreckage, unsure of what to do next.